Angela Michelle Carr.
Angela Michelle Carr.
Anote Joseph A.J. Laguerre Jr. Gerald Sean Gallion.
Gerald Sean.
The names of 3 victims took center stage at yesterday's remembrance ceremony of the August 26th mass shooting. To discuss the Dollar General attack 1 year later now, I'm joined by Dr. Kimberly Allen, CEO of 90 Forward, a nonprofit group working to end racism in Jacksonville. Hi, Kimberly.
Hi.
Also joined by the Reverend John Newman, senior pastor at the Sanctuary at Mount Calvary. Good morning.
Good morning.
Will Brown, race, inequality, and poverty reporter at Jacksonville Today.
Good morning, Ann.
Good morning, Will. And also Elizabeth Andersen, CEO of OneJax, an interfaith organization devoted to restoring civility and respect. Good morning, Elizabeth.
Good morning.
Dr. Allen, you helped organize the event yesterday. It was an emotional day, we should say. What should we be thinking about on this 1 year anniversary?
The thing that we should absolutely be thinking about are the families and their survivors, first and foremost, because what they have experienced is unimaginable. And as much as we in the community are grieving with them, our grief in no way compares to what they have personally experienced. And so keeping them front and center in any and everything we do around this day is going to be of the utmost importance.
And one of the focuses of yesterday's ceremony was a soil collection enterprise that the audience participated in. Explain to us how you came to that idea and what it symbolized.
So we partner with the Equal Justice Initiative over in Montgomery, Alabama. That's Brian Stevenson's work. And he, as part of his work, created what's called Community Remembrance Projects. And it is the goal of those projects is to acknowledge and recognize victims of racial terror lynchings that occurred post the Reconstruction era and pre-Civil Rights era. And so the ritual that we developed since 2019, when we were starting to acknowledge victims of racial terror lynchings here in Jacksonville, is what you saw yesterday. And that was us bringing it into a present day event that we, as a organization, as the steering committee of the Community Remembrance Project here in Jacksonville, based on the definition we determined was a racial terror lynching.
And what does the soil symbolize for people who are participating in that ceremony?
It symbolizes 2 things. The first thing is that for all we know, the blood of the victims is still there. In addition to that, it is the blood and sweat and tears of previously enslaved, the indigenous people here with us. And the second thing that it represents is an opportunity for new growth and new life that will eventually sprout out over time as we see things change, even after a 100-year-old event or something as recent as a year old.
Reverend Newman, you led the invocation at the site of the shooting yesterday. How do you offer the faithful any solace after this kind of a hateful act?
Well, ultimately, our solace comes from our faith traditions, so we must always rely on that. But at the same time, there's always going to be some level of disturbance because there's only so much solace you can have when we realize that this event could happen at any moment, any day. It could happen today because of the level of hatred and vitriol that's in our community. So while we're praying for healing, we're praying for a sense of comfort. At the same time, we recognize the volatility in the atmosphere that's particularly in this election season that is so pervasive and so combustible. It wouldn't take much for someone with a sick mind to once again be triggered and commit such a horrible act. So on the one hand, we always will resort to calling on God for grace and for help and for strength, but recognizing at the same time, this could happen again.
And you spoke to as well the sense or a desire for retribution, the instinct that people have as a human to seek some sort of exact some revenge for something like this. How do you address that? How did you address it yesterday for people who weren't able to be there?
Well, the reality is that it's a very human thing to want to lash back when someone has wounded you, to go into a certain kind of not only protection mode, but also a vengeance mode. But because we are people of faith, we recognize that we don't overcome evil with another act of evil. We overcome evil with good. And we work assiduously to make sure that we shrink the level of hatred in the community. So it's an ongoing work. But no, we cannot go tit for tat. We have to do better than that. We have to go higher than that.
Elizabeth Andersen, there's also plans to install a memorial marker along Kings Road. It was unveiled yesterday for the first time, honoring the three people that were killed. What is it about that marker that is significant in terms of the work that OneJax does?
Sure. I think anytime that we can bring people together to understand one another, to really experience what another has experienced, then we can build empathy. We can start to build bridges toward understanding. And really that's at the heart of hate, is the misunderstanding of the other person. And so has always been, for more than 50 years, the goal of OneJax, is helping us understand each other regardless of our differences, and to show up with one another with civility and respect and love and compassion. And if we can have a little bit more of that in our community, then maybe we have a little less terror, a little less hate.
Will Brown, you covered this story for Jacksonville Today, and it's one of those stories that's very difficult to cover, not just for the violence and hatred directed at a community, but as a reporter, being a part of that targeted community. How did this story change you as a journalist, and how did you manage to stay focused on your work with all of those emotions?
It, oh gosh, it still messes with me. I struggled mightily yesterday. Reverend Newman's invocation really pierced my soul in a great way. But I told myself, okay, get it together. And when it's all over, maybe you can let it out. But one thing I can say is that it's changed me, because there's not a day that goes by that I don't keep the programs from the funerals of Gerald Gallion and Angela Carr in my notebook with me every single day. And whenever I have a bad day, I sometimes look at these and say, these folks should still be here. And if it weren't for, to this day, I call what happened at the Dollar General people forgetting how to act. Because who thinks I'm going to drive to a different county, I'm going to write about my desire to kill, I'm not saying that word on air, and then I'm going to go do it, and then some folks say, well, it's racially motivated. No, it's racist. And for me as a journalist, I'm always just so committed to the truth and calling a spade and not a spade a trowel. So if I focus on the truth, people might not like it, but it's the truth. And so the whole time I've just focused on these three people. Gerald Gallion was a father. Angela Carr was a grandmother who was speaking to her family moments before she was killed. And Angela Laguerre was a gamer who was just trying to make some money. So, he's a 19-year-old who loves playing video games. Who wouldn't do that? White, black, brown? How many 19-year-olds don't try and make money so they can play video games?
And he was the employee at Dollar General
Yes.
that was murdered.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that's what I focused on.
And for people who can't see, you do actually have those programs with you in your reporter notebook that you carry. And I've seen you pull them out before. They really are something that sticks with you. Yeah. Kimberly Allen, 1 year later, what are we looking at in terms of steps forward, steps back? We know that DEI is a continuing target at the state level, more recently here at the local level, where there have been some efforts to defund any diversity, equity, and inclusion programs in the city budget. How do those battles interact with the remembrance ceremony and the crime itself in the work of 90 Forward?
I think they are at an interesting intersection, in part because what I saw yesterday was an overwhelming display of unity and love and just community building. And when I intersect that with what I see happening across the state to diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, I'm also disheartened because these things are in direct relationship with each other. Diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts are intended to help people, one, just respect each other at a baseline, make sure that we respect each other. And the efforts that I have seen across this community in relation to DEI has been around unifying the community and inviting people into our city government that is supposed to be working for them, inviting them in to say, we want to work with you in a different way. We want to elevate your culture. We want to highlight the beauty that comes from whatever you've experienced as a people. And because of rhetoric, folks are afraid. And so we don't have an accurate definition. We don't have an accurate interpretation. Instead, we are going off of what everybody is saying it is versus what it actually is. And everything in me that I have seen in this community as of late around diversity, equity, and inclusion has been nothing short of making sure that people see themselves within our community's tapestry.
Will, I know you have to take off for a story in just a couple of minutes, but in terms of how these bills are moving through either the state level or the local level, that's something that you've continued to report on. Just recently, a hate crime bill failed to pass the city council.
Correct. The city council essentially said, we already have this covered, so we don't need more protections. That's for them to argue. What I would say is they probably haven't heard from the entirety of Jacksonville, because the folks I speak to would prefer to have these more additional protections. Obviously, I'm not speaking for the entirety of Jacksonville, but the people I have heard from disagreed with the city council's position. There have, the state, I think, secured, an additional $5 million for Edward Waters and security funding in this year's budget that was actually signed. And there was $1 million that was from last year's state budget that went to Edward Waters University for security. And then, there have been the First Coast Relief Fund. Dollar General has awarded hundreds of thousands of dollars to help that, which mostly went to nonprofits. Most of them have focused on Northwest Jacksonville and parts of the East Side to ensure that, like Dr. Allen was mentioning, that people are seen and heard and respected and reflected in the tapestry of Jacksonville.
Yeah. If you're just joining us, we are discussing the 1-year anniversary of the racist mass shooting at a Dollar General in Northwest Jacksonville. You can join the conversation live on air by calling 904-549-2937. You can also email firstcoastconnect@wjct.org or reach out on social media. We have a call now from Wells on the South Side. Good morning, Wells. Go ahead.
Good morning. Good morning to your panel, and I want to thank 904 and Dr. Kimberly Allen for soil collection yesterday. I was there, and it was a very moving ceremony. I do want to say, though, at this point, it is time to really hold the instigator of this violence accountable and to start to work towards really confronting racism in Jacksonville. And the instigator of this is Ron DeSantis. The attacks he has levied on the African-American community has given a green light to these white supremacists to do what they did. The false ideology of white superiority still exists. Our city council, has voted to remove money for DEI. And I think that it's time for us to truly come together and confront the false ideology of white supremacy, the propaganda of racism in our city. And I'll just say thanks again to Dr. Allen.
Dr. Allen, obviously there is a political element that was not really discussed too much yesterday, and I want to ask you about that. But first, let's hear what Mayor Donna Deegan had to say on this subject.
It's not enough to just remember Angela, AJ, and Gerald in moments of reflection. We must honor them through our actions, our ongoing actions, and our words. We must strive to create a society where diversity is celebrated and where every individual feels they belong. And we must expand the work that is harnessing our city's diversity, not undermine the people or programs that nurture it.
So there wasn't much politics discussed yesterday, but she is nodding at that effort to defund DEI at the city level.
Yeah, and quite frankly, what I have been telling people in general is we have gotten comfortable not voting in our best interest. If we say that we care about diversity, equity, and inclusion, if we say that we care about our neighbors, if we say we care about gun safety, if we say we don't want racist policies or racist people to feel emboldened to do things, the fact is that we have to show up and vote. And a 20% or less than 20% turnout in August is kind of is not the right message to send to folks if this is not what we want. And so everything is on the ballot, every single ballot. And I have been stressing to young people in particular, but anybody that I've come into contact with, any and everything you care about, let's sit the person aside for a second, because as a 501c3, I can't get into that anyway. However, when you vote or don't vote, you are allowing the introduction of policies and things that are going to govern your life. And the example I've used is it's like going to a restaurant and being given a menu, and you say, "Yeah, pick whatever for me. I'm whatever," and they bring you shrimp, and you're allergic to shrimp. That's what happens when we don't show up. Somebody can literally make a decision about you that could kill you because you didn't exercise your right. And so if we're saying that the community we want respects everybody, nurtures everybody, welcomes everybody, we have to vote in that interest.
Elizabeth Andersen, there have been some moves towards pushing back on a rise in race hatred and acts of racial hatred, including the anti-swastika bill that the city council passed. I think it was now 2 years ago almost, because of projections that had been, put on buildings of anti-Semitic messaging. So, and also this mayor has, taken some strong stances on Confederate monuments, which were considered an issue for a lot of people in terms of a symbol of a racist past. So there has been some progress in terms of, moving towards an inclusive, at least from the government standpoint, kind of inclusive posture in healing some of those wounds.
Sure. I mean, I think that one of the things that we talk about all the time at OneJax is that diversity is a fact. Right? We are not the same. We are all different. There are lots of ways where our identities intersect, but diversity is a fact. And creating a community where people feel welcome and there is a sense of belonging through policies, through legislation is really important. That's how we get to a city that is thriving. That's how we get to a city that is prosperous. And it's important that we invest in people and policies that will help move the needle, that will help bring us together in a more unified way so that we can all be our highest and best self.
How do you remove the politics from those conversations? Because it does seem that those are more politically charged than at least in recent memory.
Sure. I mean, I think we recognize that there is political gain for some folks by keeping us divided. And so as a community, as neighbors, we have to be willing to look at each other, to acknowledge our shared humanity, and to say when we work together, regardless of how we might be different, we are actually better. We're actually stronger. And it's going to take the people really stepping up, voting, having their voices be heard through their actions, to send a clear message, I think, to politicians who would rather seek to divide and exploit our differences for power, that we won't stand for that.
Reverend Newman, this is one of several race-based crimes that occurred in recent years. There was the 2015 incident in the church in Charleston. There was the 2019 incident at the Walmart in El Paso, 2022 mass killing at a grocery store in Buffalo. And so this is part of a series of events. How do you hear from the community about how it affected people personally here different than some of those other events elsewhere? Or did it?
Well, I think every community that suffers this kind of violence is affected because there's an interconnectedness with all of our communities because we share the same color of skin. And I have to go back to the linkage we were just speaking about in terms of diversity, equity, inclusion, and the attacks on it, because it is all connected. The breeding ground and spawning ground of the level of hatred that is existing right now is based upon, in some parts, on a tremendous misunderstanding or disinformation campaign about DE&I. I'm a pastor, so you may not know this, but I chair the Executive Education Advisory Board at Howard University School of Business, and I teach conscious leadership and DEI there, so I can speak to this. Diversity, equity, and inclusion has been sold as a zero-sum game to the white community. That in order for those of us who've been sitting at a table to have somebody else at the table, you've got to take my seat. That's a lie. And it's calculated disinformation. What DE&I says is, because these 10 chairs have been at the table, we're not asking you to give up any of the chairs. Build a bigger table so that everyone can have a seat. So it's not zero sum, but it's been sold as such. And so people assume that I'm going to have to give up something in order for you to be here. The second thing is they assume that because you're here, I shouldn't see you, because color blindness is supposed to be now the goal. Let me give you this quick little thing about color blindness. We are diverse people. You cannot exclude anyone from just the optics of diversity. But when you do not see everyone in who they are in terms of their personhood or ethnicity, not race, because race is only one human, but in ethnicity, then what you ask by default is for everyone to fall into the default culture. And the default culture is whiteness. So in order to have color blindness, what you're asking folk of color to do is become actually a version of whiteness that doesn't offend you. That's the issue. Now, we can beat around the bush all we want, but that's what's really going on here. And so until we really deal with the disinformation and speak truth so people recognize, now, if you can politicize this fine to get elected, you do that. But let's deal with what's true here. DE&I is the biggest lie in terms of how it's being attacked that I've seen since I've been on this planet. It's an absolute travesty.
We have a call for Tom at Naval Air Station, Jacksonville. Good morning, Tom. Go ahead.
Oh, good morning. I just wanted to voice my opinion in support of an earlier caller, Wells. In as much as Ron DeSantis did not invent hate, he certainly has authorized it. He certainly has tried to normalize it. Wells was bringing up politics. Hate, hurt, and harm for your neighbor is not political. Hate, hurt, and harm for your neighbor is satanic. And I wish that people would actually wake up and see that and pay attention. That's my comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. We also have a comment from Deb on Facebook. She says, thank you, Dr. Allen. We can change for the better when we all vote. Also, JP on Facebook saying we need to rebuild the fabric of our communities to make them more loving, caring, and just. Elizabeth, I want to ask you, one of the decisions that was made by our sheriff and then ultimately by the local news media involved this racist manifesto that the shooter left behind. Very difficult read. Some stations chose not to use any of it, or news outlets chose not to use any of it, and some chose to use some to sort of illustrate the level of hatred that this shooter felt. Where does an organization like OneJax fall on having something like that out there that is clearly a call for violence, but also can somewhat illuminate the thinking of this racist shooter?
You know, I haven't really thought about that before, Anne. I think that putting content out there like that, I think, can be a little dangerous. I think understanding what motivates people is important. I think that we need to be really honest with ourselves about the motivating factors that seed hate so that we can really meet people where they are and move forward. But I think we've got so much ugliness out in the world. And I think when you've got somebody who has committed such a heinous act of terror and violence, I don't know that we give those words life. I don't know that we continue to let that manifesto stand or be praised or be shared. I think it just can lead to more toxicity.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Allen, your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with Elizabeth, and I also see the other side, and my mind immediately goes to Emmett Till
Mm.
and his mother's decision to have an open casket funeral so that people could see the ugliness of what racism does to people. And so I think on the one hand, I'm with you. Like we there's enough just brutality in the world. And there are some people that if they don't see it, they'll never believe it.
It's interesting, Reverend Newman, because she references Emmett Till, but there was another famous photograph that was also published, I think, by Jet, of Johnny May Chappelle, who was a local civil rights martyr who was murdered in a racial incident here in Jacksonville. Um, and the only photo that her family had of her was her deceased, her husband standing behind her. But that also was a photograph that they chose to publish in that same idea of making people see something that was really hard to believe had been done.
Well, I think going back to the conversation we're having right now about this, that it's really important to kind of weigh, where the benefit is, like almost like a cultural cost benefit analysis. On the one hand, we do need to see the ugliness of racism, the level of hatred that's perpetrated against people of color. On the other hand, how does that trigger people? Either on the one hand, oh, I'm going to get recognition if I do this. Let me mimic this and copycat it. On the other side of the equation, the horror that it reminds people of who've suffered that in their families or those who they love or care about. So we have to have a balance. But I do think that we have to have a balance as not burying one aspect of it. Or maybe you share some but don't share all, so that we take those things into consideration. But the only way you overcome, what is that old statement? The best sunlight is the best disinfectant. So we have to, in some way, bring sunlight to the sickness so people can stop hiding from it. Because people like to do that, to assume, well, it's not as bad, you're making it worse than it is, and or blame shift. So I think it's important that there's a balance. You've got to show some of it. So this exists. This manifesto, this creed is real. But on the other hand, have sensitivity to those who may affect and trigger at the same time.
And Kimberly, we're going to wrap, but this is the first annual recognition of that mass shooting. Going forward, what do you see this annual event looking like? How might it change? What are your hopes for it?
So the community talked at length yesterday. Councilwoman Pittman, Miss Darlene Neal, the Grand Park Association president, and the mayor talked about there being a memorial each year. And I think it's going to take whatever shape the community wants, and that's the shape it should take. Whatever it looks like year to year, however they want to, however the families feel like they want to participate or have it look, I think is how it should look.
Well, Dr. Kimberly Allen, Elizabeth Andersen, the Reverend John Newman, thank you all so much for being here and talking about this.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.